Awesome. Hello, everyone that's participating in Human MOOC and others who might be watching. We're really glad you're here. Tonight, we are just completely thrilled to have our guest, Jim Groom, with us. And of course, Whitney Kilgore is here and tweeting and probably in Google Hangouts too are Maha Alfrey and Dave Hellman. Jim Groom, if you haven't heard of him, I don't know where you've been if you haven't heard of him, but he is the Director of Teaching and Learning Technologies at University of Mary Washington, and he has a long and storied experience in instructional design. And normally we kind of do these hangouts as an interview, but since he's all about storytelling, I think we're just going to let him tell his story. So Jim, over to you.
Well, you have to be responsible for what you've just unleashed. And we were talking a little bit before we got on live, and I was thinking, like, the next iteration of Human MOOC, you need to get the Human League song Human and lead in, right? So Robin, just think about it. Bong, 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 it's only human. And you slow in because they have that water drop, and you slow in, and you human on top of the Human MOOC, right? And that's the kind of little detail that changes everything. More seriously, thank you for having me, both Robin and Whitney. I appreciate it.
Sure.
And as I was telling you both before we got started, I'll tell anyone who will listen about what we call the Summer of Oblivion, because the Summer of Oblivion might be the single funnest time I've ever had teaching, and it wasn't necessarily fun when I was doing it, and I'll talk about that. But it was a lot of fun. And when you approached me and talked about this notion of both, triggering events and cognitive presence in relationship to teaching and learning, and maybe what that means not only more broadly for pedagogy, but more specifically for pedagogy online, I did think a lot about this moment back in the summer of 2011, which we affectionately call the Summer of Oblivion, which was, and let me be specific for people who don't follow DS 106, it was part of a digital storytelling class we teach at the University of Mary Washington. And we had a 5-week section, and the plan was to experiment, quote unquote, with this class and with the students, although not telling anyone, because I don't know if what we did was ethical, but the idea was to actually teach the class as a character. So it's a storytelling class, it's completely online, and the idea was not teach it as Jim Groom or Martha Burtis, who kind of co-taught it with me, or Andy Rush, all of whom I'll talk about shortly, but to actually pretend I was Dr. Oblivion. So that was my name. I'm not even a doctorate, right? I play a professor on TV, literally. But the idea was to actually, take this persona, and the persona actually has a cultural, legacy. Dr. Oblivion was the character within David Cronenberg's classic film from 1985, I believe, or 84, Videodrome. And Videodrome, Dr. Oblivion, what's unique about him is he never talks or comes on to anyone, never comes and talks to anyone face to face, right? He's only mediated by the television screen. And so his whole thing is that television is realer than your life. Like, television is the retina of the mind's eye, is what he says. That's a quote. And I was struck by that. And I was struck by a professor who would suggest the same about online. That online is realer than anything we could do in face-to-face, especially if you're teaching an online course. So the idea was to pretend to be Dr. Oblivion, not thinking anyone would get the reference, and to come to the class and basically present myself as a completely different person. I shaved my head, what little I had left of it. I had a mustache rather than a beard, and I kind of changed my glasses, and I wore a suit, and I was Dr. Oblivion, Dr. Brian Oblivion. And when I started, I came down that morning before I started, I didn't tell my wife what I was doing. And when I came down, she was like, "What is up with you? Like, you look like your dad." And it was true. And I was like, "I'm Dr. Oblivion. I'm playing this thing at school. I'm going to be this character for the next 5 weeks." And she's like, "That's weird. You look weird to me." And my kids were like, Dr. Oblivion, Dr. Oblivion. Like, they're young enough, they didn't really know, and they had fun with it. But I went in, and for an hour, 40 minutes, I gave a lecture on video, streamed out as Dr. Oblivion. Completely straight, no pretending, not breaking the fourth wall, just being Dr. Oblivion. And I did it, and I was kind of like, I'm feeling it. Like, I felt like Dr. Oblivion. I did that for 2 more days. So 3 days, like hour-long lecture. And the idea was to kind of play it straight. And by the 3rd day when I was done, went to the people I work with. I was like, this is crazy. Like, I'm losing. I don't know who I am. Like, I'm having an identity crisis. Talk about triggering events, right? I was really having an identity crisis. And so I stopped. I said, I can't do it anymore. I'm just going to go back and be Jim Groom and just say this was an experiment. It didn't work. And Martha Burtis, who was right there in the office, was like, why don't you make Dr. Oblivion disappear? And I was like, what? And she was like, yeah, like, play the story. Like, have Jim Groom be the TA, have him come back in and say, look, Dr. Oblivion's here and make it an event for the class. And so I'm going to share my screen and show you some of what happened as a result of this kind of moment in which we were playing, playing along with the story from the beginning. But the story kind of took a life of its own. And it's interesting because after I kind of presented this and talked about this, I heard someone else present who really put what I was doing into context. And Ray Land, who's the professor of higher education, which is such a weird title, right? To be a professor of higher education. It's like the highest professor in the land. You are a professor of higher education. Anyway, he teaches at the University of Durham in England. And I happened to be at a conference, and he was presenting, and I was presenting. And I heard him present about this idea of the pedagogy of uncertainty. And to me, that's what the Summer of Oblivion was. I mean, the first 3 days I had this kind of loose map. But for the next 5 weeks, it just took on a complete narrative that was being shaped not only by the students alongside Martha, myself, Andy Rush, who were kind of building the class, but also other people who were in the online community coming in and shaping the narrative. So it was this kind of distributed narrative. Like I said, it pulled from David Cronenberg's video drone film, and that's James Wood. And this is actually Dr. Oblivion. So this is what I look like. This is the glasses, 60s glasses, the bald head. And this is
Jim, I can't see your screen. Oh, there it goes. Sorry.
And the animated kind of GIF, right, of Dr. Oblivion. And so the 3rd day, this is the poster that Michael Branson Smith, who was in New York, he made it. And this is kind of the poster that became iconic about the Summer of Oblivion. The idea, if you see this missing professor, tweet about it. And from there, hilarity and also a narrative ensued. Students, there were about 25 students in the online class at Mary Washington working alongside, open online people from all over the place. Todd Conway pretended to be the other Dr. Oblivion, who was a doctor in Scotland, who was mysteriously murdered because he was confused with this Dr. Oblivion. Dr. Oblivion had his daughter. His daughter, Bianca Oblivion, was a student aide who came on and was just a character. And then there was Detective Tim Droom, who was another version of Jim Groom. I mean, it was completely terrible. Like, it was B narrations all the while. But the thing is, students started to get into it. There was this notion, I mean, as you guys are kind of framing it, of a cognitive presence. They kind of congealed around the story and they got into it. They got into it so much that when Dr. Oblivion went missing, Jim Groom, the TA, took over. And Jim Groom, the TA, got a little bit power hungry, and this is part of the narrative. Like, now that I wasn't having the identity crisis, I could really play up the kind of persona of Jim Groom, and I started banishing students from the class who I felt like weren't listening to me, which is, again, I don't even know if you can do that, but that was part of the class. They would get on Skype, we would talk with these live streaming, and they would say something I found I didn't agree with, and I said, you're banished from DS-106. So one of the students, Alan Liddell, started making these News on the March videos. And these were kind of like propaganda videos about basically preserving the spirit of Dr. Oblivion while he's missing and this tyrant Jim Groom is taking over their class. And they call, well, rather than me saying it, let's watch this video because I find it very, very entertaining. And if nothing else, you'll get to see a great piece of art that one of the students, Alan Liddell, created as part of the Summer of Oblivion. Oh, sorry, let me go back. That one didn't want to do this work. So I should have.
News of the March. Sectionalism rocks the Oblivionite camp as TA Jim Groom goes mad with power and banishes DS-106ers en masse. The family Oblivion thickers while DS-106 burns, so clearly new leadership is needed. First martyr to the cause after the Oblivions is Araba, who was banished from DS-106 after questioning Groom's seemingly absolute authority. So let it be noted in the annals of history that DS-106 is hereby dissolved, its power over our minds illusory and its message of total student domination illegitimate. From the ashes of DS-106 arises a new order, DS-107, led by none, controlled by none, for the benefit of all who seek relief from the oppression of the TA. We are the true heirs of the legacy of Dr. Oblivion, and we declare before the world that our purpose is to depose the monster and see him displayed in chains for all to see. With that in mind, carry on the legacy of Dr. Oblivion with your radio and video assignments, as we wait in joyful hope for his return to us. With Oblivion on our side, we cannot fail. And to all enemies of DS-107, seek not to bar our way, for we shall win through, no matter the cost.
Okay, so as you can see, the aborted vision of Dr. Oblivion, which was fun, but at the same time, I couldn't kind of maintain it beyond what I was doing, became a rallying cry for students in the class, particularly Alan Adele, who was having fun with it. And this kind of rhetoric is really interesting because there's this rhetoric of propaganda, and it turns out that Alan Adele had spent, 3 or 4 of the last 5 or 6 years in Afghanistan. And he had come back from Afghanistan as part of the war, and when he came in, he was really deeply interested in propaganda. And so rather than, me saying, do this assignment at this time, he took that notion of the propaganda and he built it and grafted it on top of the story. And he became one of the real narrators and framers of the class experience for not only other students, but for the people at BTLT that were doing the class and for the online class. So it's actually that student became a node in the network of presence, of narration, of telling the story, and of defining the story. And that distribution, for me, was the real key of it. Is not only this notion of students, the student domination is illusory, and they're, factionalism, and they're starting their own class. I mean, that's beautiful, right? That's what you want. But also that tongue-in-cheek narration of the experience is just awesome. Like, it's so cool to see them get into that, to have fun with it. And I mean, for me, that was just when I saw that, and we all were watching it in the class. I mean, in the office, as this class was kind of unfolding on Twitter and YouTube and on blogs, and we were just like, this is it, right? Like, we're in it now. And so for the next 3 or 4 weeks, we played to it. Students would, it was kind of like a repartee, right? They would say something, we would say something back. They would still have assignments to do, and they would be held to a standard that they had to master design, visual, audio, and video. But at the same time, we were creating a theme and a kind of a space wherein that kind of work could have fun and also be narrative. So one of the things that happened is Dr. Oblivion as a character started to creep in not only to the students, but to the rest of us at Mary Washington. So here's an example, another example of this omnipresent space of Dr. Oblivion that at this point just became a kind of almost a gag, but a fun one. So this is Andy Rush. He works with me, and you'll notice he has a kind of bald cap on with the mustache. And he's showing the students, and he's a media kind of specialist, and he's showing the students how to edit and do video. And he has this kind of long hour video that we're talking, and over the course of the video, he looks regular at the beginning, but over the course of the video, he starts to get a mustache, and then he puts on the bald wig, and there's this constant theme of Dr. Oblivion that kind of takes over. The other thing that happened is, towards the end of the class, it turns out that Dr. Oblivion and Jim Groom, who goes missing, were abducted by the jilted TA, Martha Burtis, who was supposed to be the TA but didn't get the position. She was angry, so she took them and brought them to Camp Oblivion, which was the summer camp, kind of like the slasher movies, and she buried them, or hid them in the basement, and was abusing them supposedly with power tools. And she also killed a few students, which is probably not a good idea in any narrative, but it happened. And really it jumped the shark. You see the whiteboard behind there, Camp Oblivion. Our green screen was no longer working. We were at the end. We had people dubbing it, and it just became completely tongue-in-cheek. And I think that made it even more alluring for everyone that this was not about high tech, this was not about a beautifully produced experience. This was about having fun, telling stories, and through that experience of having fun telling stories and forming a community, the class didn't seem so much like a class, right? It seemed like a happening. It seemed like a moment wherein that triggering event of trying to do this in a very different way created a completely different sense of how teaching and learning could happen at the auspices of the web. And whenever I talk about, the Summer of Oblivion, I don't try and talk about it, and so this is how you should teach your next online class. Like, yeah, right. Like, I mean, that would be completely disingenuous of me. It would be completely an insane experience. At the same time, I do think it opens something. But this is the last thing I'll show of the Oblivions. This is Jim Groom and Dr. Oblivion having a final conversation after Martha Burtis was apprehended and taken to the authorities and arrested for her acts of malfeasance. And this is them having their kind of, what happened. This is basically the Jim Groom what happened video, which is kind of a classic. Or so I say.
Jim Groom, what happened? Yeah, why did you banish the people from DS-106?
Well, I'm not really sure what happened that day.
So I will play the whole thing. Feel free to find it online. Interview with Jim Groom, Dr. Oblivion. But I will say this. There was, for me, while teaching this class, a triggering event. You see those two characters, right? One supposedly Jim Groom, one Dr. Oblivion, but both some digital presence of me. And that notion of DS-106, at least from the beginning, when I started teaching it in 2010 and was still teaching it now, has always been about interrogating this virtual space and thinking about questions of how the web works, and more than that, where we are. Like, what is our sense of identity online? How much of that do we control? How much of that have we kind of, capitulated to silos like Facebook and Twitter? And they provide a lot, but what have we given up in exchange? And this notion of how do we narrate who we are online? When people search you, what do they find? But these deeper questions about some sort of existential being online, like how do we be online? How do we interact with others online? How do we narrate who we are online? What are some of the kind of, deeper philosophical implications of virtualizing this sense of self? And so DS-106 has always been about thinking through that stuff. And this narrative, I think, personally gave me an example to do that in ways that truly not only created a sense of, fun and chaos, but truly were deeply unsettling. Like unsettling like when you read something like Nietzsche, right? Like you go to college and you come across an existentialist, you come across some idea, some philosophy that rocks your mind. And for me, I think like everyone should feel that way to some degree about the internet and the web. Like if your mind isn't rocked by all the different things that are happening and all the different ways we can share and all the different notions of presence that we have, then you're not paying attention. And the fact is so little of our pedagogy actually deals with that and struggles with that. And so, as Ray Land said, and as I noted in the beginning, this notion of a pedagogy of uncertainty for me was really appealing because I think it started to get at some of the deeper cultural questions, I think, as a broader culture, not just a U.S. culture or Virginia culture, but I think internationally for those who are online somewhat regularly, they kind of struggle with. There's this vision of like, what does identity mean on it? And that's questions across notions of nationality, race, gender, and how do they kind of reinforce or kind of diverge from some of our assumptions, over the last century or so. And what's unique about it? What's consistent? All these things, I think, came across for me while teaching this class. And I think I can't speak for my students. I think some of them got something out of it. But for me, I've never wanted to teach in the same way again. Like after teaching as a character on TV, like Dr. Oblivion, I mean, it just started to show me, like, maybe not every class is going to be me shaving my head and going through that crisis, but it's going to be collaborative, it's going to be experimental, and it's going to try and push hard on this question of what online pedagogy is and what it means, and, you know, how we understand that as a kind of a concept beyond, you know, a system in which we dump stuff and share it, and it's always kind of outside of the broader, deeper philosophy that's undergirding this distributed notion of networks that's redefining our culture. And so if we're not teaching networked ways of thinking and learning, I think we're doing our students and ourselves a great disservice in this moment. And so DS-106 for me was just one small way at that. And I've been writing it as a thing to talk about, but I mean, I don't mind it because I love it, and it's still going strong. And other people just every day, I mean, we talked about it before we got, like, to be happy to get out and see someone write a tweet that's awesome, or create a radio show. Like, you know, there was 18 radio shows produced by the Noir 106 students over the last 3 weeks, and they were amazing. And then the open online students who were doing it just for fun, and there were like 12 of them, created a show that's like, you know, God, This American Life, eat your heart out. Like, this stuff is awesome. And these people are doing it because they want to. And they're not doing it, and they're commenting on the students' work because they want to, because they like it. Now, they might need a head examination, and I'm who am I to say, but I just think it's, to me, it's like, you know, for all the crap on the web, and there's enough of it, there's so much awesome things. And for me, DS-106 congealed that, and it's made what I do that much more cooler, exciting. I don't feel like I'm going in work to make the donuts. I feel like there's a network of people just doing amazing things. And somehow we were able to tap into it. And I think we were able to tap into it because, A, we were open, we were prepared to fail, and this notion of uncertainty, like we had the chaos principle. But I don't think at the heart of it were we trying to kind of, you know, undercut or, you know, disrupt, to use a word that's laden with students' experience, but really to kind of open up the idea that, you know, online learning and this notion of the web is trippy, and there's crazy stuff underneath it, and like identity is not, it's fluid here, and like you need to think about this. And if your professor is shaving his head and pretending to be someone else and then goes missing, something's up, right? And the fact that it can happen, you should be present, and you should be thinking about that. So, you know, again, that's the summer of Oblivion in a nutshell. There's a lot more. There's a lot more people involved. I'm not doing it justice as a kind of comprehensive thing, but you can search out a lot of that online. There's a couple of links that are being tweeted out that will give you some idea of that. But it was, for me, when I thought of your themes tonight, and when I thought of what you guys wanted to kind of get into, I thought that story might be a useful way to start some discussion around questions of not only triggering events and how we interpret that we can talk about, but also this notion of presence, right? And cognitive presence for me, seeing that the students were not, I wasn't like, come into my creepy LMS and make a discussion board that's half-baked, but say something, and then I'll say something, and we'll play these stupid roles. Like, go create something awesome, and let other people well beyond me see it, and then let me promote it. Like, let me get other people to see it and feedback on it. Now, that's a cool way to use the web. Like, that's a cool way to use this thing that's transformed the way we communicate. Wow, why aren't we doing this more generally? Like, because we do scale on the web. Like, that's the whole thing. It's like we do scale. Like, I can scale out and promote 25 people's work on the web as a professor. And frankly, I'd rather do that than sit around and pretend to grade them. Right? Like, I'd rather say you did awesome stuff. Let me promote that. Let me use my network to let people know that you have mad talent. And they may like that. They may say, I hate that. And then that's their decision. And they say, I don't want to take this class. And then that's why, actually, before we do the class, I actually send them an email. 1 month out, 2 weeks out, and then a week out. And they get increasingly more scary. Like, you should really think twice about taking DS-106. And then next one, you should drop DS-106. And then the final one was like, why haven't you dropped DS-106? You're going to get crushed. And I figured by the end of that, those folks who really don't want to be online, they don't want to be open, they don't want to be potentially, I mean, because I understand there are people who don't want it for very good reasons, but then this is not the class for them. And at some point, they're going to need some group or some community or some institution help them navigate the web, because it's not going away, even though they don't want to be part of it. It's here, and they're going to be part of it. So I think it's a little disingenuous for them to pretend like, well, I don't want to deal with it. Like, well, where are you going to do your research? Well, how are you going to communicate with people in your classes? Well, like, and we build these elaborate systems as part of universities to actually obfuscate the fact that we created the web as universities from 1969 up until 80, 82. This amazing thing. And then it blew up in 93. Well, that's the internet. With the web, it blew up in 93, and we had this amazing tool that we helped build the protocols for. And yet, we spent the last 15 years trying to engineer a way to hide from it. It's absurd.
Yeah, and you know, it's funny because we're getting ready to start the very last week of the Human MOOC, and you touched on just about everything that has to do with this week, everything from presence, and that's certainly been the thread weaving the whole course together. But I think that what we hope this week is for everyone is an opportunity to really kind of think through their curriculum and how they might be able to create a triggering event. And certainly the going missing kind of rogue professor shaving people's heads may not work for everyone, but it's a really good nudge. Well, it's a little bit of a shove off the cliff, but it's a good move for people to see how it can be done. And maybe it's an extreme case. It's certainly a great story, but when each of the individuals in the course are starting to rethink where they might fit in one of these triggering events, I would say that this pedagogy of uncertainty is transformative. You've certainly described how it's transformed not just the student learning process and how the students have become leaders, but your own teaching. And so I hope that happens for everybody in this MOOC. I mean, I think that's our ultimate wish. But certainly you've had an impact on online education as a whole. The more you share the story, I know there's more impact across online educators and their courses and their students. And so by having you share it across this course, I hope everyone takes away that they have to be brave, they have to be bold, and they have to try really random cool things to get their students super engaged.
A good point there, Whitney, that's probably worth saying something about is, you know, the second time, we've done this a couple other times, once with Twilight Zone, once with The Wire, the written TV show, and that was a way to do it that was powerful, I found, is do it around the theme. Maybe it's the theme of the TV show Twilight Zone. We did this one, the theme around noir, so storytelling around noir, and that enabled students to take on personas themselves and tell stories. And you know, I don't care what discipline you're in. A lot of people say, well, you're doing digital storytelling, it's easy for you. I mean, I think regardless of your discipline, you can find a way in to actually engage around the questions of narration and storytelling, and mixing in research depending on what you're doing. The thing is it takes planning, and it takes work, and that's the thing. I mean, it's fun, you know, and we didn't plan it maybe as much as we did, but once we were in it, we were locked in, and we as a team were building this, you know, 4 or 5 weeks, and it was kind of nice that it was short. And I think a triggering event, depending upon how you plan it and think about it, doesn't necessarily have to be for an entire class, right? It can be something that's very focused up front or early on to bring people in, to give them a sense of maybe how this is different and how it can create a community that's then comfortable. And I think early on we did with the Noir 106 class, which is what we're teaching now, Film Noir. Early on, we created a community where it wasn't about any one professor. It was 3 professors, but we were kind of dealing with each other's students. So there were 75 students plus 3 professors. And we decided to actually communicate with them via video and actually have interactions with them on Twitter and kind of spend time building community in distributed ways. And that took time, but it also allowed them now to come on and tell stories and interject and communicate with us in a much and I kind of A, not a silo like the LMS, but B, as individuals within a broader network that we can then use our network to push out the work they're doing and have other people see it beyond the class. So, I mean, a triggering event could also be for as simple as, something a professor says about a work or promotes a work that keeps them engaged. Like, I don't think students in DS-106 hate it when I comment on their work or when I promote their work. And it's a small thing, but it's a trigger to show that there are other ways to share out and to promote the work they're doing. And it may not be as elaborate as shaving your head and going missing and all that. Like, it could be in some ways simpler, but I don't know.
Well, I just wanted to say this reminds me so much of a conversation I had about significant learning experience in those moments of shift that you have when you come across something that really makes an impression on you. I have an undergraduate degree in art, and I had a couple of those kinds of experiences with paintings and seeing the work of an artist that I really admired. And it's the kind of thing that you want to happen so bad in a class that you're teaching. I think it's really useful for people in Human MOOC to hear that you can actually plan those kinds of things. And they work. That's what's really encouraging. So I appreciate everything that you shared.
And this reminds me of a story, Robin. I think I almost start every story with, Robin, I think you told me this once. I need to stop doing that and just tell the story. But when we were at the Sloan Conference, I think you told me about a class in sociology where they were teaching the students how to respond to I guess disasters. And so the class, like halfway through, partway through, they're teaching them all these techniques, and then halfway through they stage a disaster in the class, and they're having to respond to each other and care and give comfort. Maybe you can fill in the gaps of the story that I didn't get right, Robin.
You got it right. They surprised the students with a disaster in the middle, and I think it's quite shocking, but memorable and life-changing experience for a lot of the students. So.
Yep, that's a good point. We had folks from Michigan State University come here, and they did a zombie apocalypse MOOC, or what they called a Molly. And what they did is Chris Irvin, who's working there, Kisa. There are some folks in Michigan who work together as an instructional design team and with a faculty member. Faculty member's name is Glenn, and I'm forgetting his last name. And he was a social worker faculty member. And what they did, and it's really cool, is he basically and them, they created this world where he's a social worker and he's telling, like, what would you do if you're faced with a situation where, someone got bit by a zombie, and you had to determine as a group, and they were class broken in a group, whether to, do you kill them? Do you quarantine them? And like, these were real things that in the case of a disaster, the zombie apocalypse was obviously playing off the pop culture, but real questions came up within the question of a disaster. And they framed it as if it was a narrative. Every week, the apocalypse got more and more complex. They had more and more deeper ethical, moral questions to deal with. And the students would report back on YouTube videos about what they decided to do and why. And they would have almost like survivor moments where they'd say, well, our group decided and one of them said this and that. They had to really work their way through this. And the narrative that they were working through, zombie apocalypse, which maybe it played out a little bit, but at the same point, filmed beautifully, and also got at so many of the issues that this professor needed to deal with when you're dealing with questions of catastrophe and the psychological implications of catastrophe. And I was just blown away by that. You can find it at zombie.msu.edu. And it is really just amazing stuff that they've done. And they came here to talk to us about it. And I was blown away by not only the quality, but the deep, what you were saying, Robin, which really captured me, is that deep, significant learning experience that's transformative. I can tell you just by looking at some of the stuff they did that these students, many of them, like this was not just a class that you go root through. This is a class that kind of engages you and changes the way you think about what you're doing in life.
So I think that's the class that actually Robin told me about. So it was a good connecting of the dots here with all three of us. Hey, Jim, I have to tell you that we've had several of these hangouts, and every time it breaks my heart to have to end them because even though, you know, we're kind of 5 minutes over what we were going to do time-wise, I'm sure everyone, oops, and see I'm getting Skyped and everything, just stop. People are dying to continue the conversation, and certainly they can do that in the Google Plus community, on Twitter using the Human MOOC and or DS106 hashtag. They can do that inside the course in Canvas. We're all over the web as well. So Robin, I'll let you and Jim close it up. I just wanted to point out that I'm going to miss finishing the conversation.
Well, the only thing I have to add is I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to have somebody finally mention zombies. I'm a zombie-holic, so I think that's really awesome. It's completely made my night. So
well,
really,
and you see the bloody lab coat behind him, right? So in some of the videos that people have posted, I've said, look at the background and consider what your surroundings are like, right? So I've been attending to the stickers behind you and the bloody, I think it's a lab coat, and so that's been fascinating.
On the top of it, you can almost see that stringer bell from The Wire. So students have created a Swede last semester where Stringer, in the episode where Stringer gets shot. And so they gave me that as a prop from that Swede, which is great. You can find it online. Just do like Wire Swede Stringer bell. And I love it, and I put it up, but every time I get on a Google chat or Hangout, people are like, you know there's a bloody lab coat behind you. I definitely know that. All right.
So thanks so much, Jim. It's been a blast.
Yeah, thank you. Awesome, as always.
Thank you both for having me. I really appreciate it, and thank you for letting me talk about Dr. Oblivion yet again. It's
Loved it.
But I love it.
Yeah. Okay, well, without further ado, we'll say goodnight then.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Night.
Okay.
Great.